Okay, so from the presentation by Mark and Omar, we were clearly presented with the fact that the technology, that computing itself steps into the background, right? So what steps into the foreground is networked sociality, right? People socialize, it becomes more important than the technology that stays in the background. And the question really is that I would like to open up is, what are the pitfalls and what are the opportunities of this very shift that's taking place, right? Often, so I will mainly talk about technological development and not talk so much about architecture per se. And often there's a perception that the future is really very predetermined. There's a certain default to it. And I think it's very important to remember that there are many possible futures, right? That there are many ways in which development can proceed. And it's basically a battlefield of contesting interest groups, right? If you think of the early development of the telegraph and the way it was used for online dating, right? The first sort of when operators of the telegraph started to make dates and would actually meet in person then. And so the future isn't just Minority Report, right? It's maybe this whole process is also exemplified to an extent by this battle over net neutrality that we see, and hopefully a sort of very widespread participatory movement in this. One thing in this context is that I want to point out that it is not, that I'm not saying that technology is a fix to everything, right? Of course, technology is not the fix to all social problems, right? But however, on the other side, I think a divide into camps almost, where people are thinking that everything can be fixed with technology, so, you know, techno-determinism. And on the other hand, we have people who really all too easy kind of discard all possibilities. So what I suggest is somewhat in the middle, a view, an approach that really tackles really human needs, the things that really matter, but is sort of open to both, you know, also open to seeing the limitations of that. So we talked also in the preparation of this event, for the last 3 months, we talked on the mailing list that we established for this event, or that we used for this event, a lot about the future, right? And what I asked myself in this conversation was, if we talk about technological development, the question should really come up, what is it addressing, right? Which needs is it addressing? Are these needs completely superfluous and maybe, you know, you could almost say, is what comes out redundant and maybe even nonsense? Or is it really addressing actual needs that people have and maybe the crisis that we are facing? So the context of this short presentation here, I'm taking from these books, Adam Greenfield, who is here, Everywhere, Collective Action, you know, Technology Matters, and this wonderful book by Andrew Feenberg on transforming technology. So they sort of set a good background, I think, for our conversation, hopefully also for the next few days. I would argue that it's common sense that technological development is mainly dominated by the private sector and the military, and then you have smaller actors, which, you know, could say are hobbyists, artists, architects, hackers, you know, government regulators. And of course, you could extend that list. This is not all of it, but you think the main driving force is really these two big players. So if you take it from there and you sort of follow me on this little trajectory and say that corporate labs are the cheerleaders, really, for technological development that decide about the acceptance or rejection of technology, then the next step that you could take is you would basically ask what this kind of, where this trajectory leads us, right? And is really these kind of interests that drive this development, are they really addressing very core human needs, right? So very few people design technology, And all of us here and the public at large, right, is basically impacted by it to an enormous amount, right? It is extremely, it impacts us every day, right? Every part of our life almost. So why is this not more part of a public deliberation? When have you heard for the last time a debate about technological development on the radio or on television, right? Or where part of a big public meeting had decided about the next iPod. So another problem is also that these technologies are often lacking transparency, right? So there's a lack in transparency of coding and rules that dictate the behavior of these everyday things. So I think what a long-term goal really should be is a movement, right, of democratic participation in design decisions. And this is not necessarily a new point, but maybe one that we can reconsider in the context of this debate. So it's really a few, like I said, who shapes the technological design process and paternalize the many, right? So what really stinks, right? So what are really problems? So if you think, what are really problems to address, right? What is this crisis we are talking about, you know? I was thinking of my friend, you know, Faye, who's sick, she has AIDS. You know, so we have the AIDS pandemic, right? None of this comes up in these discussions, or far too rarely, you know. Early snow in Buffalo, so global warming, right? You enroll in school with Photoshop 5 and graduate with Photoshop 7, right? So there's a fragmentation and de-skilling of labor. Nintendo University in Washington State, right, doesn't even have any humanities. Basically, you know, just-in-time knowledge, right? Or did you talk to tech support today, right? So there's this outsourcing of unfulfilling and dangerous work to the global south. You have a lack of global distribution of knowledge. You have to check your BlackBerry at night, so there's a clear time poverty in the United States. So jobs are even differently paid depending on your, you know, if you're willing to have your mobile device on all the time or not. There's a salary difference. And, you know, a mom with 4 children working 4 jobs and still not being able to pay the rent, you know, the working poor. How about like some device, you know, addressing that? Health insurance, right? 47 million Americans are not health insured. So I'm not saying, again, I'm not saying at all that these problems can be, you know, in some grand gesture solved by technology, not at all. But I think that they should also not be forgotten in that debate, yeah? People who are in the foresight business, right, they just love the magic of technology, right? So it's extremely, you know, enticing for people to buy things because of their magic. And so just think of self-healing service, and the problem is really not so much, I'm not against magic at all. I'm also not against play or open-ended research, or I'm certainly not arguing for a kind of over-determined process of developing these things. There should certainly be play and there should certainly be magic and all of this. But there's certainly a problem with a mystification of technology. So things are magic to people because they don't understand how they work, right? And that is really a very kind of bad and sort of black magic, right? What basically Bruce Sterling calls us the technological voodoo. And it makes us forget the flimsy nature of things in front of us.
Pixie dust. Pixie dust. Pixie dust. Magic self-healing server pixie dust. How's it work? Server goes down, sprinkle on the pixie dust, servers back up. Use it regularly and servers solve their own problems. Easy. I like. What's it cost? It's cheap. Cheap. Soy-based. Soy-based. Biodegradable. Looks like we got a winner.
That's what I'm talking about. Not, right? So, friends. Don't let friends buy useless network objects, right? So what is really an added value of technology? So what is really addressing things like human dignity or well-being? And we should ask this in the context of thinking of networked objects, of the Internet of Things, and of envisioning a new city, a new urban context. And because if you follow this little trajectory here, you see that this is basically a very, if you accept, or if you are with me, that I say that technological development is mainly market-driven, then you will also have to come with me when I say that it's basically foremost in the interest of profit, which is not predominantly interested in human dignity and well-being, and not even in quality, but in speed and in profit, right? Market share. So not everything possible is desirable. You know, do I really need an umbrella that lights up when it will rain? Do I really need like an egg on my table that tells me if the stock market goes up or down? Do I really need like another feature in Photoshop to pay another $100 more for their next release? So there's a lot of redundancy and nonsense. So with the network increasingly pervading the city, there will be more interaction between people and things, right? So both Omar and Mark have both outlined this quite convincingly and very clearly. And again, don't want to paint like a dark picture, but certainly one part of this picture is that there will be a vertigo of choice, right? Which is already now identified. You don't even need all this extra interaction that we are talking about here to be depressed and anxiety-ridden, right? So in a study we just found out like 2 days ago that there's an enormous amount of US Americans who is addicted to the internet. And it has also a clear link made by a study out of Swarthmore College about a link between choice and depression. So if you have too much choice, the choice itself isn't a problem, but the triviality of the choice is a problem. So the kind of choices we are faced with is a problem. And that maybe we should also consider in this kind of conversation about the Internet of Things and networked objects, right? We saw similar images from Mark and from Omar. So on the right, you have the new UK passport with a RFID tag, and this is maybe something about transparency, you know, so you really have to pull off your Samsung TV label to see the RFID tag in it. This is a point that I ruthlessly stole from Ellen to talk about decentralized participation. So there are basically examples of this, right? So there is an increased number of web applications that are developed. So there is participation in that realm. We have an enormous number of, every day you could say, almost say there's a new web application coming out, right? And so they are not designed by some computer science PhD. They are relative non-experts. On the other hand, here's an example, right? Listable. People can create their own lists and add resources that they appreciate. On the other hand, amateur participation in hardware design is much less common, right? So you have this on one hand, but not on the other, because the complexity requires more expert knowledge. Okay, so if you take this further to citizen involvement, you will see that it really requires a kind of felt consciousness, right? An understanding of the technologies to be able to actually speak to them, right? Not really that different from politics in general, where you really have to know your congressman to actually vote, right? So you really need to understand the technology, and what can we do in this context is basically speak clearly across disciplines, right? So not hide behind a professional language that will not be understood by the other end of the room. There's an example that is maybe useful in this context, which is in Denmark. There was basically a system introduced which is similar to a jury duty, in which citizens are asked to comment on technological developments, right? So they basically call in and demonstrate technologies, and they discuss and comment individually. So not like in a jury duty where like on a jury where there's a unanimous voice. Here's basically individual voices as feedback to this development, right? So David Nye gives this proposal to really say, maybe why don't we combine this kind of Danish model, he doesn't mention it, but this kind of deliberative polling with controls used to evaluate new drugs, right? And again, like if you go back, what I said earlier, and you accept that this has really a clear impact on society, right? I mean, on our everyday life, then you will maybe not think that this is such a bad idea. Other examples, let's say the rhetoric of participation or attempts in that direction, where the development process of the World Trade Center, where I would say it probably largely failed, and Maybe Ted Byfield can tell us more about this later. And then the FLOSS development, free, libre, and open source movement, which also at least has this gesture of free participation. In fact, is also very hierarchical. Okay, so what can we do out of this effort is basically really supporting, DIY movements. An example would be, I'm not a fan of O'Reilly, but okay, Make Magazine, and community mapping in London. And in this context, if you think, for instance, of Google setting up San Francisco with a free wireless network very soon, well, this is a clear test bed for geospatial services, right? So, I mean, maybe this would be a very good point to also bring up in this discussion now, to actually demand free geospatial information. Geospatial information wants to be free, and we should ask for it. Other design proposals for networked objects include scenarios in which things bear witness to atrocities, like in Darfur, in Woomera, in Rwanda. There was just recent news about a man in Lebanon basically documenting the destruction of his village with his cell phone and video, and having 45,000 visitors a day, or I think even more. So I think it's crucial, and I just repeat this one more time, I'm always at the end, that there's this crucial process of developing technologies that should really be impacted by citizens. So how do you motivate this? Russell Harding basically talks about or observes this fact that it is very hard to motivate people towards a vague future, right? So like this beautiful, let's say, global warming or so. This is much too vague, right? But it's much easier to motivate people against a private local prison that will be built in their neighborhood. So it's easier to motivate people against specific things than sort of drawing them in the effort of something rather vague. So this is my last slide. My question is basically, how can we occupy the imaginary of this technological development? And I break it down in a short-term and in a long-term goal. Micropolitical technical interventions, right? Take a Familiar Stranger or other projects like that. Really clearly rearrange network sociality, right? So the way people interact is clearly changed by cell phones, as Mark pointed out. So if artists intervene in this process, that's clearly a way of having a role in this process. Another one is the refusal to buy useless prestige objects, to compare yourself to your neighbor, and really work on a sort of transparency that leads to a really felt consciousness of the social impact of technologies, that people really feel they have a stake in this process. And a long-term goal, which Feenberg maybe misjudges a little bit, which is really not hardly possible outside of a socialist context, would be to have a really broad democratic movement that determines technological design process, right? A social movement maybe is something on the way to that, and creating of alliances of individuals is something that contributes to this, but I see this really as something very hard to realize in this society, and rather as a long-term goal. So I end by repeating these points to support the do-it-yourself movements, to support, highlight, energize, and give space to pervasive inventiveness, and to clearly speak across disciplines, to not hide behind a professional language, and to create alliances of individuals to develop technological awareness and to support demands for transparency of code and hardware. Thanks very much.